Amelia Hartwell had built her life on precision, control, and the quiet power of being the youngest CEO in her company's history, a woman raised on strategy and steel who operated boardrooms the way seasoned captains weathered storms, but none of her tailored suits or polished speeches had prepared her for the violent crash that sent her company's private jet spiraling into the sea like a shattered bird of metal and fear, the taste of saltwater and smoke still hot in her lungs as unconsciousness dragged her under before fate, or luck, or something in between threw her bruised body onto the ragged shore of an uncharted island where the world was nothing like the world she ruled, and the first thing she remembered when her eyes opened was not her name or her title but the unbearable sunlight and the scratchy fabric of sand gluing her legs to the earth, and then a voice, deep and wary and far too calm for the circumstances, saying, "Don't move too fast, you hit your head pretty hard," and when she squinted through the throbbing in her skull, she saw a man kneeling beside her, all rugged edges and weather-worn muscles, his shirt torn at the sleeves and his jaw shadowed with days of stubble, his eyes a storm-colored blue that spoke of survival instead of sympathy, and she tried to sit up, words tangled on her tongue like seaweed, but he steadied her with hands that were gentle despite their strength and added, "You're safe for now, but we need to get you out of the sun before it blinds you." She wanted to protest, to ask who he was, where they were, where the rest of her team was, but her throat burned like she'd swallowed glass and only a rasp came out, something halfway between his name and a question, until he lifted her effortlessly and carried her toward the shade of palm and rock, and the world blurred again until the crackle of fire and the scent of something roasting pulled her back to awareness, and she realized she was lying on a makeshift bed of leaves and thick woven cloth, the man crouched nearby, turning fish on a spit as though this were an inconvenience rather than disaster, and he looked over his shoulder and said, "You got lucky I was fishing the cove when your jet came down. I couldn't reach the wreck, too deep, but I got you out before the tide could finish the job." She blinked, trying to reconcile catastrophe with his calm, and forced out a whisper that sounded more like a demand, "Where are we?" He poked at the flames and said, "Somewhere off the main routes. I've been here long enough to know no boats pass close and no planes pay attention," and when she stared in disbelief, he added, "Name's Noah. Before you ask, no, I didn't choose to be here and yes, I've tried getting off." That answer unleashed panic in a slow, suffocating wave through her ribs, and she pushed herself upright despite the aching protest of her body, her mind racing with images of rescue teams, satellites, cell towers, anything but this island and this stranger who spoke like this nightmare was permanent. She tried to stand, her legs trembling like branches in a storm, and snapped, "There will be people looking for me, my company, the authorities, search teams," but Noah only watched her with an expression that held no mockery, only a quiet, exhausted realism that made her anger feel childish, and he said, "I hope you're right, but storms hit these waters hard and signals don't get through. Until someone shows up, survival comes first," and she hated that his words made sense, hated that she was suddenly aware of how dry her mouth was, how heavy her limbs felt, how the tropical air clung to her like a second skin, and when he handed her a hollowed-out shell of water, she took it only because her body demanded it, the liquid cool and clean and startling against her lips, and once it eased the burn in her throat, she whispered, "Was anyone else, did anyone make it?" He shook his head once, slowly, and something inside her twisted like metal under pressure, memories of the pilot and her assistant crashing into the silent certainty of loss, but Noah didn't press, didn't offer empty comfort, only said, "Eat. Rest. Then we'll figure out the rest," and though every part of her resisted the idea of surrendering to anything she couldn't control, the exhaustion finally dragged her down and she drifted in and out of uneasy dreams filled with fire and water and the echo of her own helplessness, until the sky dimmed and the stars emerged like holes in the darkness, and she woke to the crackling lull of embers and the distant hush of waves, the air cooler now and heavy with night. Noah sat a few feet away, carving something with a small knife, the firelight painting his features in a way that made him seem carved from the island itself, solid, solitary, unbreakable, and she realized then that he wasn't just surviving, he was existing with a purpose she couldn't yet name, and when she asked, softer this time, "How long have you been here?" he didn't look at her as he answered, "A little over 3 years," and the number hit her chest like a physical blow, stealing breath and logic and every illusion she'd clung to since waking, and she said, incredulous, 3 years. Alone. He paused his carving and finally met her gaze with eyes that held a grief so carefully buried it was almost invisible, and replied, "Not always alone," and before she could ask what he meant, he stood in motion toward another shelter made of driftwood and leaves, and inside it she noticed a smaller woven mat, a stack of little wooden carvings shaped like boats and animals, and she understood in a sudden, piercing flash that he hadn't chosen solitude, he'd lost something, or someone, and the weight of it still lived in his silence. The thought unsettled her more than the isolation, and as she lay back down on the makeshift bed, she stared at the canopy of leaves above her, her mind racing between disbelief and dread and a stubborn spark of determination that refused to be smothered, telling herself that tomorrow she'd find a way to take control again, to make plans, to get off this island and back to the world where her decisions mattered and her name meant something, unaware that fate had already begun to twist their lives together in ways neither of them could undo. Morning came not with the comfort of routine but with the cries of seabirds and the rustle of leaves stirred by a humid breeze, and Amelia woke to find Noah already on his feet, dragging a net from the shallows with practiced strength, his movements economical in a way that spoke of long habit rather than hope, and she forced herself upright, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, the bruises along her ribs, the dull throb still haunting her skull, but she refused to let pain define her, not when she had built an empire on refusing to yield to anything, and she approached him with a forced resolve, saying, "I need to see the crash site," her voice steadier than she felt, and he glanced at her with a look that held both caution and curiosity before nodding once and saying, "After we eat. You'll need your strength," and though she bristled at the implied instruction, she followed him to the fire pit where he handed her a portion of roasted fish wrapped in broad leaves, and the flavor shocked her with its simplicity, her hunger overriding her pride for the first time since she'd landed here, and as she ate, she studied him covertly, noticing the scars on his forearms, the way his hair curled slightly at the ends from the salt, the quiet vigil in his posture that spoke of someone who expected danger even in peace, and she finally asked the question that had hovered between them, "You said you weren't always alone. What happened?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and he answered with a calm so controlled it bordered on silence, "My daughter was with me. A storm took our raft before we could reach open water. She didn't survive," and the words sank into the air with a finality that made Amelia's breath catch, and for a moment she didn't know whether to apologize or retreat, but he was already standing, brushing sand from his hands, nodding toward the trail that led through the dense trees and said simply, "Come on," leaving her to follow with the hollow ache of his confession echoing through her mind, and as they walked through the undergrowth, the ground soft beneath their feet and the canopy thick enough to dim the sun, she realized the silence between them was no longer hostile but heavy with unspoken understanding, and when they reached the cliff overlooking the water, she spotted the twisted metal faintly visible beneath the surface, the remains of the jet reduced to an underwater tomb, and grief surged through her with a sharpness that made her knees buckle, but she stood firm, fists clenched, whispering to herself that she would not break here, not in front of a stranger who had already seen too much loss, and Noah, without looking at her, said quietly, "There's no way to reach it without gear. Whatever you lost down there is gone," and she wanted to scream that she couldn't afford to lose anything, not time, not people, not control, but the words tangled uselessly in her throat, leaving only the truth she had never allowed herself to speak. Without her world of structure and power, she was just a woman standing barefoot on the edge of nowhere with nothing but fear in the company of a man whose strength made her feel fragile in a way she despised.